Resident Evil hasn't exactly had the best track record with multiplayer games recently, with the exception of Dead by Daylight, but that doesn't really count. RE-verse has definitely had reviews, to say the least, but that's a story for a different day. Today, I'm going to talk to you about the series' first dip into multiplayer survival horror. I'm, of course, talking about
Resident Evil. Outbreak.
According to producer Norikata Funemizu, the initial concept of Outbreak was being tossed around before the release of Resident Evil 2 back in 1998. There was a growing interest in network gaming over consoles, so Shinji Mikami, the director of the original Resident Evil, suggested that Funemizu try his hand at a network-based game. An early design of the game consisted of a small multiplayer minigame in which players must survive as long as possible, but the team decided to remove it since it failed to encourage teamwork. Yeah, apparently players would just run away from the horde of enemies and die alone rather than work together to ensure each other's survival. Eventually, the development was placed on hold indefinitely, until a couple of years later in February of 2002 when Capcom's Production Studio 1 revived the project and took over development. The game was later revealed to the world at a PS2 press conference with the working title of Biohazard Online. Outbreak was the first among Capcom's initiative to develop 3 network-focused games on the PS2. Fun fact, the other 2 games being developed were Automodalestia and the first Monster Hunter. The ultimate goal was to have one of these games reach 1 million sales, and both Monster Hunter and Resident Evil Outbreak eventually hit that milestone. The game would make an appearance at the Sony E3 conference on May 21st with a video showcasing real-time 3D backgrounds as opposed to the usual pre-rendered ones in previous games. The video also revealed 4 characters and showcased the ad-lib system and character communication. The ad-lib system was chosen over voice chat because the development team thought that it would ruin the atmosphere. Later that year, the game was renamed to Biohazard Network, and by October, 18 different scenarios were in development, with even more in the concept phase. They were really cooking with this one, and by May of 2003, the game's title had been changed to Biohazard Outbreak, or Resident Evil Outbreak in the West. The number of scenarios was reduced to 5, but don't worry, the cut scenarios wouldn't go to waste. The release was a little rocky, to say the least. The game was released in Japan on December 11, 2003, and the North American version released a few months later on March 31st of 2004. The European version was heavily delayed until September of 2004 due to issues with setting up a secure network with service providers and the PAL/NTSC differential. Resident Evil Outbreak has 5 scenarios with different enemies, events, and endings, and I'm going to do my best to summarize each one, with the first one being Outbreak. The beginning of Outbreak is set a few days after the initial outbreak of the T-Virus in Raccoon City, but before everything devolves into total chaos. 8 people are drinking at Jack's bar on the 24th of September, in spite of news reports of increased violence in the city. These 8 people are Kevin, an off-duty police officer, Mark and Bob, 2 security guards, Jim, the subway worker, George, a doctor, David, a plumber, Alyssa, a freelance journalist, and Yoko, an Umbrella employee with amnesia. The bar staff, Will and Cindy, are preparing to lock up when a man walks in and bites Will on the neck. Police officers Arthur and Raymond Douglas call out to all civilians to evacuate the area, and the group jump into an apartment building to meet up with them. The group makes their way into a storm drain and exits at the Apple Inn, where they meet Dorian and 2 more survivors. Dorian is unable to drive them far in his police van due to the barricades blocking the residential area. The group walks past Raccoon Mall, where they discover an ongoing police operation to destroy Main Street and kill hundreds of zombies with bombs. The police operation turns sour though when Eric and Elliot are killed, forcing the group to assemble the detonator themselves. But once all the parts are found by the players and put together, the bomb goes off, killing the horde of zombies. Soon after, police reinforcements arrive to secure the area, and the group leaves on Dorian's police van. The second scenario, titled Below Zero in the original script, is the second scenario in Resident Evil Outbreak. It takes place in The Nest, the secret lab from Resident Evil 2. Yoko Suzuki leads George Hamilton and Alyssa Ashcroft to the facility's escape tunnel at the bottom of the lab. Monica steals Yoko's ID card and flees to escape, all while Yoko sees her carrying a large attaché case carrying a G-virus sample. Monica is then attacked by an unknown creature while trying to use a turntable to escape. Moving up to basement 4, players discover the turntable, but the entire floor is frozen and the lift won't move. Reacquiring her ID card on the floor nearby, Yoko goes back to her previous corridor and uses it to open a shutter. They then use a blowtorch to melt the ice covering a lever, switching it on. This not only unfreezes the floor and the lift, but also thaws out a series of hunters that were encountered as frozen statues earlier. As players rush back to the lift, Yoko uses a key dropped by Monica into a nearby panel to activate the lift. And as the group defends themselves from the hunters, Monica reappears with the capsule in her case broken. She then loses consciousness. As the lift rises with the players and the train car on it, Monica rises from the ground and her chest bursts open, revealing a G-larvae that kills her instantly. The larva makes its way up the lift, and I'm honestly gonna let this scene speak for yourself because I think it's really fucking cool. Once the G is dead, they board the train and head to freedom. The third scenario, titled The Hive, sees 3 survivors taking shelter at the largely abandoned Raccoon General Hospital. Dr. Hirsch walks in on them in room 301 by accident and suggests they leave the building immediately. When power to the elevator suddenly goes out, Hirsch leaves to turn it back on, and he is then attacked by leeches drawn to a zombie bite on his arm, and is used as a vehicle in which they can assume a humanoid form known as the Leech Man. No, not the Leech Man from Resident Evil 0. After that, the players take the elevator to the first floor, and once there, they go to the office, grab the part of a memo file which contains the Carmine code. Then, players go back to the elevator and take it to basement 1. When players get to the basement 1 passageway, the Leech Man appears. Players must use blood infusion packs on the floor to distract the Leech Man, and eventually make it to the fixed temperature experiment room, where the Leech Man appears, and players must once again distract him with the blood infusion packs. Then, you must set the temperature in the room to high and kill the Leech Man once and for all. The scenario comes to a head when the 3 find a boat in the underpass entrance and use it to escape, but the path gets blocked by the Queen Leech. They bail, and the boat crashes into the Leech. After defeating the Queen Leech, the players escape through the sewers, ending the scenario. The fourth scenario, titled Hellfire, follows a group of survivors taking refuge from a horde of zombies in the Apple Inn. Meanwhile, 2 firefighters, Len and Charlie, inspect the boiler room of the inn. After the boiler shows signs of a malfunction, the 2 retreat but are too late to avoid an explosion caused by the malfunctioning boiler. The ensuing damage to the building forces the structure to lean over the door, blocking the survivors within the inn's courtyard. As the survivors travel around the burning hotel, they run into various zombies, lickers, and dying or already dead hotel visitors. When the group reach the Apple Inn's front lobby, they fight a half-transformed licker known as the Suspender, which appears to be a zombie-slash-licker hybrid. Soon after the Suspender's death, a firefighter breaks open the door and helps all the remaining survivors out of the inn. Alright, I'm gonna level with you. The Suspender was such a wasted concept that was never revisited. Like, a halfway transformed licker just seems so fucking cool and creepy, and she just hangs there. I know the concept was tossed around and scrapped during the development of Resident Evil 2 Remake, but It's a shame it never got fully realized. Anyway, that's just my 2 cents. Let's move on to the final scenario. The final scenario, titled Decisions, follows George Hamilton as he leads a group of survivors to Raccoon University in search of the Daylight antivirus that can cure the T-virus. A team of Umbrella mercenaries also descends on the university to apprehend Greg Mueller, the scientist behind the Daylight antivirus. Unfortunately, Mueller unleashes Thanatos, a tyrant of his own creation, which quickly dispatches most of the squad, except for Nikolai, who tries to obtain a blood sample by shooting it with a vacuum tube needle. Lucky for the players, that blood sample is one of the 3 components used to synthesize the antivirus. Once players incapacitate Thanatos by luring him under faulty wiring, they can grab the blood sample. When the players acquire the other 2 ingredients and attempt to synthesize the cure, they are confronted by Mueller, who is subsequently shot in the head by Nikolai. Players synthesize the antivirus and attempt to escape through the courtyard, but there is one last roadblock players must deal with before they can escape. Thanatos R, who survived and mutated into a 12-foot tall super tyrant. Players can either fight it with their weapons or use an ampule shooter from the nearby M8 Greyhound and use it to fire a dose of daylight into the tyrant, killing it almost instantly. The group then escapes in a helicopter with the Daylight antivirus in hand, and Raccoon City is destroyed by the government. But whatever happened to those cut scenarios, you may be thinking? Well, those were carried over into
Resident Evil. Outbreak File 2.
Outbreak File number 2 was developed over the course of a year, improving both gameplay and network elements of the previous game. The cut scenarios from the first game's development were also carried over with even more branching paths and endings. By the way, the previous game had a bunch of alternate endings, counting all the different variations. Now, the scenarios don't have a set order this time around, with all paths ending with the destruction of Raccoon City by government missile strikes, so I'm just gonna go through the list starting with Wild Things, which follows Cindy Lennox as she leads the rest of the survivors through the Raccoon City Zoo in search of a rescue helicopter. Throughout the scenario, players encounter an array of animals infected with the T-virus, including the zombie elephant Oscar, who follows the players from area to area until he's either locked in his elephant stage or killed by the players. If Oscar isn't killed or locked away by the time players make it to the front plaza, he'll appear as the level's boss. Otherwise, you'll end up fighting Max, the zombie lion. Unfortunately, when you reach the end of the level and board the tram, it stops and the rescue helicopter can be seen on fire in the distance with its pilot's corpse not far off. Honestly, the prospect of zombie animals, aside from the ones seen in previous games, is a cool addition that is just goofy enough to fit in the world of Resident Evil. Underbelly follows the players through a subway station in an attempt to escape the city via subway train. However, another moving train crashes and explodes, waking the Gigabyte, an enormous T-virus infected flea that you need to beat to finish the level. Gigabyte is such a good pun, by the way. These games really have the right amount of camp to make them charming while still being somewhat scary. Anyway, after defeating the boss, you can either make it back to the train, or if you don't make it in time, you have to escape through the substation tower, which can be accessed through a ventilation shaft. Flashback follows Alyssa Ashcroft and a group of survivors trying to make their way to the neighboring town. They meet a friendly old man named Al who tells them of a shortcut. The only problem is that they have to take a detour through the abandoned Arklay Hospital, which was used by Umbrella to test if the T-virus could cure diseases. Spoilers, it can't, and most of the patients either died or turned into zombies. To make matters even worse, a T-virus infected plant has taken over the hospital. Oh, and there's an immortal axe-wielding maniac running around. Players must kill sections of the giant plant that has overtaken the hospital building by injecting it with a serum-filled syringe. The final boss is the core of the plant, which is later found out to be controlled by an infected Dorothy, Al's wife, who was experimented on in the hospital. Al is shown in the ending to have been leading people to the hospital to kill them as the Axeman in order to feed his wife in her plant form. If the player plays through the level as Alyssa, they will experience several flashbacks at different points in the scenario, both as Alyssa and a friend who died at the hands of a zombified Dorothy when she was investigating the hospital's ethics years ago. The player could also get different endings depending on how many files the player collected while in the hospital. It's nice to see what else was going on in the Arklay Mountains. The Axeman makes for a scary antagonist as a tyrant-like enemy that's unkillable. Honestly, I kind of feel bad for Al by the end, but anyway, he's dead now, so time for the next scenario. The fourth scenario, Desperate Measures, takes place in a very familiar location, the Raccoon City Police Station, as players defend themselves from the horde of zombies that have gathered outside. After finding several plates, the player can open a secret passage for one of the cops, Rita, to escape and find help. But before she can come back with help, the zombies break through the gates of the police station. Players must hold down and defeat a certain amount of zombies, depending on the difficulty, before completing the story. Players are then forced to leave Officer Marvin behind as they drive away while he locks himself in the room he's found in by Claire or Leon in Resident Evil 2. This scenario actually does a great job tying into Resident Evil 2 and fleshing out the RPD in Marvin's story prior to the events of that game, even if the remakes changed how he got wounded. Anyway, a nice short and sweet scenario that ties into an existing game. Moving on to the next scenario, and my personal favorite. The last scenario, titled End of the Road, follows David King as he leads a group of survivors to an Umbrella laboratory where they run into Linda and Carter, two scientists who have returned to the facility to get the cure, but before they can leave, the lab security system activates the lockdown. A group of hunters is also released into the lab to make matters worse. This is my favorite part of this scenario. In order to deal with the hunters, Carter wakes up a tyrant to fight for him that he can control with an implant in its brain. But just as the players are about to exit the lab, the tyrant breaks free of Carter's control and kills him and throws Linda off a ledge, presumably killing her. The players then have to deal with the tyrant chasing them down for the rest of the story. The group escapes to the sewers below the facility where they find Linda alive. Depending if players killed the tyrant or not, they are either washed away with Linda or are left behind to make it to the upper levels by themselves. Either way, the players encounter a mutated Tyrant R, the same tyrant from before that went through what was called the Tyrant Reborn transformation. It doesn't really look any different than a regular Super Tyrant, but it has a cool name at least. Players are given the chance to rescue Linda, who is shot by a sniper. Players have to carry her through the rest of the scenario while dodging the sniper. Players can then choose to either escape by helicopter and skip the final boss, or escape by truck and fight my favorite enemy in the whole game, Nyx.
Is that the package? What the?
A gelatinous blob of a bioweapon that assimilates any organic matter it can get into its biomass. If you've ever seen the 1988 movie The Blob, it's pretty much like that. Except it eats Tyrant R. After defeating Nyx, the players escape the city just in time before it's destroyed. God, Nyx is so cool, and I wish they would make another amorphous monster. Like, come on. Faceless, only going off instincts, just absorbing whatever it can. Make it happen, Capcom. These games are definitely worth your time. Unfortunately though, Capcom shut down the online servers in 2005, leaving only the single-player experience. But on January 1st, 2014, the servers were opened back up to the public by some dedicated fans, allowing for online play to be restored with some new additions like a ban list and leaderboards. These games are a blast to play, with a lot of interesting concepts and unique enemies. It's also nice to see what else was going on in and around Raccoon City outside of the main entries. These games aren't perfect by today's standards, but were perfect for the time when they came out. I was honestly hoping that when Resident Evil Resistance was teased, that it was going to be a remake of one or both of the Outbreak games. Resistance isn't exactly a bad game per se, but I'd rather play Dead by Daylight, since they're pretty much the same genre of game. And RE-verse is, well, it's a thing that exists. More on that in another video, probably. I honestly hope that someday we can get a third Outbreak game, or maybe even a remake of these two games. But let me know what you think of these games in the comments, and punch that like button like it owes you money. I'm the Wildcard, and I'll see you next time. Peace.